Sometimes the Bible has stories in it that really don't further the gospel narrative. And you say, well, why is that even included? Well, it's included according to Romans 15:4 and 1 Corinthians 10 for us to learn something from it. And that's going to be the case with what we're studying today. We're going to have to move through it. First assembly was a little long, a lot long. But we're going to move a little more quickly through it than normally. But I want to ask you, have you ever done something because of the emotions of the moment that you later regret? Okay. If you haven't, come talk to me. I'll give you some stories. Because I've got lots of them. All right. And we're going to read about such a case today. So Proverbs chapter 29, verse 11 says, fools, come on in, Mari and Sarah. Where are the study sheets in the? Okay. It says in Proverbs 29, verse 11, what are some examples? Our fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end. What are some examples of bad things that have happened from venting rage in particular? And you don't have to tell personal stories, but if you will, that's fine too. What's happened because people vent rage?
Football player.
What?
Football player who tackled the referee.
All right. Here, fairly locally, we've read of a high school football player who tackled a referee, and as I understand it, also assaulted his coach in the process as well. Anger. Another.
Got fired, lost a friendship. I mean, that's not, yeah, just, it could have been. What?
Yeah, you end up getting fired for a reaction like that. What's the term we use sometimes driving? Road rage. And there have been killings from that, right? People use abusive words. We read in the first lesson of this series, David was rescued from killing Nabal. Because Abigail soothed his rage. What if the thing about this, what if the basis of your rage is misinformation? What you think is right, what you think is true is not true. And that's what we're going to see today. Okay? So let's read 2 Samuel 12, 9 through 12. Somebody read that, please, quickly for us. Second Samuel 12, 9 through 12.
Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says, out of your household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did this, or you did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel.
Okay, out of self-glory and doubting his father's worthiness, Absalom essentially fulfilled the prophecy here of Nathan. When Nathan came and confronted King David with his adultery, Absalom led a coup to overthrow his father and become king. David's world was crashing around him as he escaped Jerusalem to save his life from his own son. How did this fulfill the prophecy of Nathan after David's sins? Nathan mentions two consequences. What are they?
So the sword will never depart from your house.
The sword will never depart from your house. You'll remember that in among David's sons, brother killed brother. Joab killed his son. There was treachery in the family of David from that point on. What's the second one?
Raise up evil against you out of your own house.
There would be a particular public embarrassment. What would be the particular public embarrassment?
Taking his wives and somebody else sleeping with them.
Yeah. And again, that was fulfilled with Absalom as he went on the rooftop and had sex with his father's wives to humiliate and disrespect his father. Pretty heavy consequences. Over a few chapters, chapter 16, verses 5 through 13. Somebody read those verses for us.
As King David approached Bahrain, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guards were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, and those whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a murderer. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. But the king said, what does this have to do with you, son of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? David then said to Abishai and all his officials, my son, my own flesh and blood is trying to kill me. How much more than this Benjamin? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore me this covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went, and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt.
Okay, a raving lunatic from the family of Saul added insult to David's already wounded heart. List the many offenses. I don't know the correct way to pronounce it. I've always said Shimei against David. What are some of the things he did against David?
He said murder. He was a murderer.
All right, he labeled him a murderer. Okay, what else did he do? He called him a scoundrel. In some translations, it says, you're a worthless man. What else?
Pelted him with stones.
Pelted him with stones
Dust.
and dust. And then cursed him. Okay? So can you imagine? Here's the setting. Shimei's up here on an elevated area, and David's now walking in the road, and he's throwing stones down, he's throwing dirt down, he's cursing him, he's calling him names, and all this is going on. And it's not surprising that one of David's men, knowing the nature of the guys who kind of followed David, said, you want me to go up and cut his head off? I mean, kind of matter-of-factly, like, that's what we do every day, which is kind of what they did every day. David's response, I think, is pretty remarkable. But before we get to that, why was Shimei so upset with David? Why was he so upset with David?
Probably went back to Saul
What do you mean went back to Saul?
from all of the interactions, David and Saul, and maybe he was borderline, had some mental issues as well, which further led to this type of behavior.
All right. There's some assumptions that Shimei seems to make. He was a member of Saul's families, and he seemed to be blaming David for the death of everyone, though Shimei had bad information. So let's break them down. He probably thought David was responsible for the death of Saul and Jonathan. You remember at the time of Saul and Jonathan's death, David was allied and living with whom?
Well, one of the neighboring enemies,
The Philistines.
Philistines.
Yeah, he was living with David was living and allied with the Philistines, and the Philistines are the ones who killed Saul and Jonathan. He probably blamed David for the death of Ishbosheth, who was Saul's only remaining son, and Abner, Saul's commanding officer. Well, Joab, who was a servant in David's cabinet, Joab, against David's will, killed Abner. And Ishbosheth was killed by two of his own commanders in his sleep. But Shimei probably thought David was the one who orchestrated both of those. Okay? From a distance, looking at it, he probably thought David's behind this. And then he probably blamed David for killing Saul's 7 grandsons. But if you'll remember the story there, Saul had broken covenant with the Gibeonites to not harm them. The covenant that was made with Joshua, all the way back to Joshua, and Saul did attack the Gibeonites. And so, because he broke that covenant that Joshua made, there was a request on the part of the Gibeonites that part of Saul's, that members of Saul's family would be executed as retribution for the attack on the Gibeonites. And it wasn't David. David made it happen. But it wasn't David who was behind it. Who was behind it? God was behind it. So really, David wasn't to blame for any of it. But Shimei apparently thought David was responsible. So what we see in Shimei is what we are apt to do when we had bad information and our emotions are out of control. Ever been there? I mean, it's one thing to have good information and have bad behavior, but it's really hard to swallow when you're acting on bad information and try to swallow that. But that's kind of where he is. You don't think straight in those moments, right? Because your emotions have overtaken you. And as I've watched heads go with me this morning, I can tell that all of us in here can relate to that. All right? So what do you think you would have done if you had been David enduring Shimei's attack?
You try to defend yourself, or
Try to defend, how? How would you try to defend yourself?
stand up, or trying to give I didn't have anything to do with that, kind of, be self-defensive, I guess.
All right, so you would have given oral self-defense. Okay? Probably should go around the room and just, get a vote. How many of you would pull a sword and go for a head? Oh, I wasn't expecting those hands to go up so easily. All right, well, thank you for letting me know. Maybe helpful to know.
When I was hungry, I'd say go. Just tell me about it.
Okay.
I'm tired of it.
Okay. Others, what would you have done?
Well, hopefully we would have remembered what Nathan had to say, and David would hopefully realize that he had brought some of this on himself.
And David seemed to. In fact, David seemed kind of resolved and resigned to what was happening. He intimates, I deserve what I'm getting. Which is kind of a sad place to be for a once triumphant king, to be treated with such utter disrespect, and him saying, I deserve it. I mean, if God has told him to curse me today, who am I to try to stop him? I deserve this. It's kind of sad. Mark?
You know, David has had some experience with Saul on having opportunities to kill somebody that was trying to kill him.
Yep.
So, maybe he based also some past experiences and letting God handle it, not him.
Exactly. Which is, again, hard for us when we get impatient and our emotions are in control. Will we trust God in those moments? One of the passages I've loved is in 1 Peter, where it says in 1 Peter chapter 2, I think it's verse 23, where it says, Jesus entrusted himself to him who judges justly. In other words, it had been talking about Jesus' suffering and the crucifixion, and it talked about him not retaliating to insults, not retaliating to abuse, because Jesus entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. Will I trust God through this circumstance, even though I don't like it? Will I let him carry out justice? And David seems to be at that point. Because here's the reality. When you lower yourself to behave like a raving lunatic, you don't really vindicate yourself, do you? You know, can you imagine what an dishonorable way, what sight this would be? If David started picking up stones and throwing them back. That's not very kingly either, is it? Okay? And yet, sometimes that's where we find ourselves, isn't it? Is we lower ourselves to begin resorting to insults, to resorting to other ways of hurting that we feel like have happened to us, and that doesn't vindicate you. So, what I would likely have done is at least try to make the abuse stop. You know, scare him off, take him prisoner, something to keep the insults and stone throwing from continuing. But David didn't even try to do that. So let's turn to 2 Samuel 19. See how it continues. Somebody read 16 through 23.
Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, buried down with the men of Judah to meet King David. With him were 1,000 Benjamites, along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's household, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed to the Jordan where the king was. They crossed at the ford to take the king's household over and to do whatever he wished. When Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, he fell prostrate before the king and said to him, May my lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind, for I, your servant, know that I have sinned. But today I have come here as the first from the tribes of Joseph to come down and meet my lord the king. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said, Shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He cursed the Lord's anointed. David replied, What does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? What right do you have to interfere? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Don't I know that today I am king over Israel? So the king said to Shimei, You shall not die. And the king promised him on oath.
Does that sound like the same guy that we just read about a few moments ago? Oh, King David, here, I am your servant. Does this sound like the same guy? Doesn't sound like the same guy. So something happened, all right? After Joab mercilessly killed Absalom, by the way, against David's will, it opened the door for David to return to Jerusalem, albeit in many ways a broken man. Shimei obviously had a changed heart. Why do we see such a different reaction from Shimei of David's return to Jerusalem than when David was leaving Jerusalem? What's the reason?
I don't know if it tells us in the text, and I don't know what we skipped through, but I'm just wondering if maybe he had time to calm down his emotions a little bit and then look back like David could have just killed me. And now I'm gonna, be thankful that he didn't, because I was acting foolish.
Yeah, by the way, the text doesn't give an explicit explanation as to the change of heart. So we're guessing about human nature, and that's a legitimate possibility. Others, what do you think?
Figured out he had this information.
It is very possible that somewhere along the way, maybe he was boasting to someone about how he had insulted David, and somebody said, well, why did you do that? And he said, well, because he killed Saul's family. He said, David didn't kill Saul's family. Here's what happened. So maybe he got good information and had a little change of heart. What other things?
It's possible too that he thought Absalom was going to take care of David. So now that that's not the story anymore, he's some self-preservation as well, possibly.
You better believe it. I mean, David is back in power and now has the upper hand, and so he's not in a position to boastfully, arrogantly accuse and curse the way he was before. Regardless, Shimei showed contempt for God's anointed, something that David refused to do against Saul. David didn't forget that. Okay? In his own time, David didn't seek justice for Shimei in his own, when he was in power, when he was reigning, but he will do something that we're about to read about. So turn to 1 Kings chapter 2. 1 Kings chapter 2, 8 and 9 and 44 and 45. These are part of David's charge to Solomon, his son, in succeeding him. He says, and remember, you have with you Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Baharim, who called down bitter curses on the day I went to Maharaim. When he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, I will not put you to death by the sword, but now do not consider him innocent. You are a man of wisdom. You will know what to do with him. Bring his gray head down to the grave in blood. 44 and 45. The king also said to Shimei, this is now Solomon speaking to Shimei, you know in your heart all the wrong you did to my father David. Now the Lord will repay you for your wrongdoing, but King Solomon will be blessed, and David's throne will remain secure before the Lord forever. He had Shimei executed. David obviously did not forget what Shimei did. Why would David give these instructions to his son Solomon? Is it vengeance going on here? Let me suggest a couple of other possibilities. When a king is young, as Solomon was and beginning his reign, people often saw the king as a vulnerable target. It's not unusual in such a circumstance to face festering subversive attacks early in one's reign after the long-term monarch dies. So, perhaps David was concerned that Shimei might try to raise or develop a coup against Solomon. So you better take care of Shimei. Part of it, I think, was to protect Solomon from Saul's household. Relatedly, it was to make sure that contempt for the Lord's anointed did not go unpunished. That was so important to David and David's dignity. And why, in so many ways, this imperfect man, David, was a Christ figure, is that he absorbed the offenses against him without retaliating. Now, again, Solomon carried out justice. That's what Shimei deserved. David didn't. David allowed himself to be ridiculed, insulted, mistreated, but he didn't retaliate. That makes him a Christ figure in that way, and a model for us when we are unfairly treated and attacked and insulted. Which brings us to the last question. I want us to have a few minutes to discuss this. What are some practical lessons for you personally from this incident? I mean, no one confronted or corrected Shimei, and that is often the best approach, because a person who is of the mindset of Shimei is eventually going to create their own downfall. So what are the lessons for you as we talk this morning?
Get the whole story.
What's that?
Get the whole story.
Get the whole story. Before you go off with a sword in your hand, you should know what really happened. Others, what's the lesson for you?
It's not our job to dish out vengeance.
What did Paul say in Romans 12? God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Paul says, do not repay evil for evil, but repay evil with, say it louder, it wasn't very hearty. It wasn't as though there was enthusiasm for that idea. He says, don't repay evil for evil, repay evil with good. Can we remember that? In those moments when somebody is mistreating or saying stuff about us, rather than repaying evil with evil, can we repay evil with good? What's other lessons?
I think the other thing is as Christians, I mean, like with anything, we should expect and be ready for things to happen that are not good, that are bad. And this is just another example. I mean, if we are prepared for someone to come to us that way, we know ahead of time the way we'd respond to them, it's going to be a lot easier than to do emotion on emotion or knee-jerk reaction.
So we shouldn't be going through life thinking that everyone is always going to love me, everyone's always going to think I'm the greatest, everyone's going to be very supportive of me. The reality is somebody, whether you deserve it or not, is probably going to mistreat you. How are you prepared to react to that?
We have situations at work from time to time with patients that come in that, sometimes they're just having a bad day.
Yeah.
It's not personal, but they come in and they're upset. We just happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And that way for any employer or, any workplace. Sometimes, it's almost expected. You never know what kind of battle people are facing, if they act that way. But again, can we be Christ-like and to be able to not pay evil for evil?
Can we be agents of grace when there is malice, or it feels like malice, going on around us? And that causes us to step back. And so that kind of preparation is very helpful. What are the lessons?
Sometimes we have to be willing to accept the consequences of our own actions and suffer justly.
Somebody's angry because of my actions. I understand why they're angry because of my actions. I'm going to let them be. I deserve it. I think that's hard to do, especially if you have tried to be penitent about it, if you've tried to be confessional about it. So sometimes we think that that's a magic key that automatically makes everything okay. Okay, I've repented and I've confessed, and now everything's okay. That is not the way it works. Even though in God's heart and mind we may be forgiven, consequences sometimes linger. And rather than trying to stifle them, we sometimes need to do what David did and say, I deserve that. Hard to do. But I think, again, trusting confession and repentance to take away all our consequences is naive and wrong. To expect other people to blame other people for their reaction, thinking that now that I said I'm sorry, Marae. What more do you expect of me? You ever find yourself doing that? You know, you should be over this now because I said I'm sorry. That's unrealistic. David understood that. And so,
especially when you take a look at it in the context of the time. I mean, he was fully within his power and justifiable. And for him not to, and to admit that he was mistaken, I mean, it's way beyond expectations. You follow what I'm saying?
absolutely.
Expectations of the time.
Yeah.
It's remarkable.
Yeah. And that's why, again, as imperfect as he was, David was a Christ figure. Because he didn't retaliate when it would have been very appropriate and easy to do. Other lessons, personal lessons. Of the characters in here, and of course David and Shimei are the principal characters, but there are others. Where do you see yourself? All right, do you find yourself like Shimei, if there's something that you think has been some kind of injustice, you're apt to, go off in a rage? You find yourself like David, kind of resigned to accepting consequences? You find yourself as one of David's men, ready to cut off somebody's head with any offense? Do you see yourself as Absalom, as somebody who's maybe supplanting others? I mean, where do you find yourself in all this? And those are just 4 examples. Or do you see yourself in this at all?
I have to say, I see myself as one of the men, not necessarily giving the sword, but prompted him. You have the ability to go do it. Take care of it.
Okay, So you might not be David, but you're one of David's cheerleaders.
Right.
You're standing in the background, you're saying, hey, you don't have to take that. And sometimes, do you find, and this is where, again, as Christians, we need to be giving godly, wise advice and not cheerleading evil. Because I think sometimes we can find ourselves cheerleading evil when we think a friend of ours has been mistreated.
We do it every day with the news, right?
Tell me more. What are you talking about?
Well, we just pick a side, you know, we're, we'll get them, you know, I mean, that's right, we'll do it.
Yeah.
Have certain things.
And I don't think that's the way the Lord wants us to respond. Yeah. All right, we're out of time. Sorry, there's so much more to say. But sometimes we need to be able to do like David and let God take care of justice. Okay? That's the bottom line lesson I hope that we left with you. Have a blessed week.